Background Harmony, 7:30 Monday on PM Magazine.
President Reagan has begun to deal this week with the need to reappraise some of his major policies at home and abroad. Hugh, really bad news in unemployment. 9.5 million Americans out of work last month.
And others were saying that big tax cuts would improve the economy and increase government revenues. And you were saying you felt that would happen immediately, not months after the tax cuts were put into effect. How do you explain today the fact that we're now facing the worst unemployment in about 40 years and tremendous deficits?
Well, I think, first of all, the unemployment in our country and the recession have not been caused by the tax cuts. There aren't many economists around, either liberal or conservative, who think the tax cuts are not going to help get us out of a recession. It's our view that the recession has been caused by the very erratic monetary policy of the Federal Reserve Board and the high interest rates that have been the result of that. And I think most people recognize that inflation is a tax as well. And we still have an inflationary, built-in inflationary policy through the Federal Reserve that is helping to remove the tax policy that most people think is an anti-recessionary tool. So it's certainly not the tax cut that is going to cause the recession or did cause the recession. I think most people also recognize that in 1981, there was a tax increase on the American people because Congress and others put off the tax cut, watered it down, and spread it out to such a point that in 1981 you had tight money, tight tax policy, and tight fiscal policy, and there's been a credit crunch. I think those policies will be reversed in 1982, and I think around that issue, Congress will have to debate how we meet the economic problems of the 80s.
I asked you about high unemployment and also the possibly historic deficits that are being predicted for this fiscal year and the next couple of fiscal years. What about the possibility that what many people are now describing as excessive tax cuts have indeed caused or threatened to cause those deficits?
It's hard to believe that the tax cut could cause the deficits. In effect, it's the interest rates and the Federal Reserve policy, the monetary policy, if you will, that is lacking in credibility, that has caused a breakdown in the financial markets and the long-term bond market. And as far as if you look at the economy in 1981, as I said before, we had a $15 to $16 billion tax increase in 1981 built into the economy because of the Social Security taxes that went up in 1981, as well as inflation pushing taxpayers into higher brackets. So 81 was a very bad year from the standpoint of the type of supply-side advice that we had given to the Congress.
When you see President Reagan tomorrow with some other Republican leaders, what will you say to him about the pressure that is now on him from many of his advisors to approve a certain limited amount of tax increases to try to ease down those expected deficits?
Well, we tried that in 1981, and the point that I will make to the president is if raising taxes could lower the deficit, then 1981 the deficit should have gone down, not up. But if you look at the early predictions by OMB as to the deficit for 1981 or 1982, they were off by about 50%. And the advice that was given to the president that if we put off the tax cut and water it down and hold it off and let inflation-induced bracket creep try to remove the deficit, in effect, it didn't work because it provided a drag on the economy. We've gone into a recession. And in effect, the deficit today is about 80% recession-oriented and not the result of the tax cut.
Thank you, Mr. Kemp. Our reporters on Meet the Press today are Hobart Rowan of the Washington Post, Lisa Myers of NBC News, and regular panelist Marvin Kalb of NBC News. We'll be back with our questions shortly.
Now, back to Meet the Press. Here is Bill Monroe.
We'll continue the questions for Congressman Kemp with Hobart Rowan.
Mr. Kemp, the thrust of what you just told Mr. Monroe was that the nation is in trouble now because, in effect, the president got some bad advice at the start and didn't go all of the way with the supply-side program. And earlier you've been quoted as saying that President Reagan and I are the only supply-side bulls left in Washington. Well, if that's so, Mr. Kemp, why do you think that Treasury Secretary Reagan and Wiedenbaum and the other advisors have deserted the supply-side ship? What's wrong with supply-side economics?
Well, I don't think they deserted the ship, particularly Don Regan. He has been quoted recently as saying that he thinks that there are some tax increases in 1983 and 84 that would help somewhat reduce the deficit projected in those years by OMB. But as far as I'm concerned, Don Regan is still a very strong supporter of supply-side economics, as are many of the administration officials. My only point in making that earlier comment was that I don't think that President Reagan and the American people really think that in a recession, it's good fiscal policy to start raising taxes to reduce the deficit, because the deficit today is not a result of the tax policy that we wisely put in place. I would have liked it earlier and deeper, but nonetheless, I think that it is good policy. We've made changes in fiscal policy through budget restraint and reducing government borrowing, and we've reduced the regulatory burden. It's now a question of restoring confidence in our money, in the currency, and bringing down interest rates by reestablishing the type of monetary policy that I don't think is capable of being followed by the Federal Reserve as it is presently constituted.
Mr. Congressman, to restore confidence, as you say, most of the critics of the administration policy, and this includes conservative Republicans as well as Democrats, suggest not that taxes be raised this year. It's true this is a recession year and you don't fight recession by raising taxes. But they're looking forward to fiscal 1983-84, when you had deficits projected in the $150, even the $200 billion range. Don't you think it's reasonable, given the flow of that kind of deficit, that some effort be made to restore the tax revenues of the government?
First of all, I have a strong disagreement with those predictions of deficits of $150 to $200 billion in 83 and 84. I think they can be wildly off simply by a 1% change in the growth figures of the economy or a 1% change in the inflation rate. And I have said publicly as well as privately to the president that I think that we ought to recognize that budgeting and budget forecasting is not a science, it's an art. And to try to make changes in 82 when the economy is in a state of very severe recession with unemployment rising and bankruptcies across the country, it seems to me poor budget policy to suggest that fiscal policy or fiscal measures can cure a monetary problem. And then secondly, I would say, Mr. Rowan, it seems to me that as we come out of this recession in 82, the summer of 82 and on into 83, that it would abort that recovery if we start raising taxes on the American people. And if government borrowing crowds out private borrowing, certainly raising taxes on the American people crowd out private decisions. And I don't think that should be done on the American people in 1982 or 83.
Ms. Myers?
If the president proposes the kind of limited tax increases that his advisors are now suggesting, will you stop supporting his economic program?
Oh, I support his economic program, and I will continue to argue my case, and will make that case tomorrow at the White House. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the president is going to make a decision to raise taxes in 83. I know he's getting advice to do so, but I still think that he is going to make a Lincolnian decision and hold a cabinet meeting, and where 11 of his cabinet members or 11 of his advisors want to raise taxes, and he'll say that there are 11 ayes and 1 no, the noes carry. In other words, I think President Reagan is going to not accept the advice of those who want to use fiscal policy alone to cure this monetary problem. If he does decide to raise taxes a minimum in 83 or 84, I'll make that judgment when it comes before the Congress. But I'm strongly opposed to, in 1982, making tax changes, particularly because I think it will reopen the tax package and it will allow the Congress to do damage, if you will, to a tax policy that I think is the right strategy at the right time. And finally, it distracts attention from the problem that we face with high interest rates, which is a monetary problem brought on by a Federal Reserve Board of Governors who believe that a recession is an answer to inflation. And I don't think Ronald Reagan believes that recessions are answers to inflation. Therefore, I think he'll reject their advice.
Well, regardless of what happens on tax increases, the president already has signed off on about $31 billion worth of additional spending cuts for 83. which include further reductions in Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, school lunches, and a host of other social programs. Are you going to support him on those reductions?
Well, they're going to be sent up to the Congress as individual packages, and they'll be supported or turned down as individual measures. And as far as I'm concerned, as I've said publicly and privately and in the Congress and in my budget committee upon which I serve, and as well as in the White House, that the problem with high interest rates and the problems of the deficit today are not fiscal alone. They are monetary. And frankly, I don't think this is a good time to be talking about reducing the safety net or abolishing the safety net or putting holes in the safety net, because as I said before, there are people out there in genuine need who deserve or absolutely require government support given the conditions that we face in the economy today. And as I said before, what bothers me the most about this debate that's going on is that so few people are willing to look at the interest rate problem and the breakdown in the credibility of the currency as a monetary problem, which cannot be cured with fiscal measures alone. So if someone came to me and said, would you take this budget cut? I plan to raise the issue of budget cuts if that's what we need to do, and I think we do in terms of continued restraint. There are many corporate subsidy programs that ought to be looked at. OMB knows there are many. They have a list of corporate subsidies that ought to be looked at, and I think we ought to take a measure of where those subsidies can be reduced rather than cutting into the programs that defend the poor's safety net.
Mr. Kalb?
Mr. Kemp, you said a moment ago that you don't agree with the huge budget deficit projections. David Stockman, who's the director of the Office of Management and Budget, is presenting a lot of these budget deficits to the president.
Right.
Are you trying to suggest that Mr. Stockman is doctoring these figures as he presents them to the president?
No, I'm not. But I've talked to Dave, and we're friends. We have a friendly disagreement over this subject, and I can show empirically that a 1% drop in the growth rate, which I think OMB is predicting too pessimistic a growth rate coming out of this recession, particularly with the tax policy that is in place, the first such tax policy, incidentally, that we've had coming out of a recession in the last 15 years. I think Dave is predicting too low a growth rate, which skews the budget deficit, and I'm not suggesting he's doing it on purpose. I just think he is absolutely trying to follow a very careful scenario that, as I said before, frankly, is too pessimistic. I think we can do better. I think the economy can do better, and I don't think the deficit is going to be $150 billion in 82 or 83.
You're saying his figures are wrong?
I think they're wrong, yes.
Well, that means that the figures given to the President of the United States by the man who runs OMB are wrong?
I think, Mr. Kalb, that you recognize that we are debating a projection upon which honest people can come to a disagreement. And there is a disagreement over this, and I'm not accusing him of anything. I just, as I've said before, think that he has the growth rate too low coming out of a recession. Every time we've come out of a recession in the 1970s, we've had higher rates of growth. And if you just miss by 1%, the deficit projected on into 1986 can be skewed by close to $200 or $250 billions of dollars. And I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just suggesting that I think they're wrong on the pessimistic side of the growth rate.
Do you feel that he's doing a good job for the president?
I think Dave has done a good job, and I think he should stay as budget director. But I would like, and I've told him publicly, I think budget is one thing. But we've put in place the fiscal and tax policy of this country. I don't want to see that changed right now. What I want to do is focus in 1982 on the fact that I believe that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors welcomed the recession. They are trying to use unemployment as an answer to inflation, and there has to be a change in Federal Reserve policy to get the interest rates down and to get the lubricant or the oxygen supply back into the economy, which can fuel their economic recovery that I think everybody in this country wants.
Congressman, you have been putting a lot of blame on the Federal Reserve Board and high interest rates for many of the current economic problems. How do you account for the fact that President Reagan has not been criticizing the Federal Reserve Board? He has generally been supportive of the Federal Reserve Board. And what would you have the president do about the Federal Reserve Board and high interest rates?
Well, I think we need a new policy at the Federal Reserve Board, one that is not aimed at a very narrow definition of the monetary aggregates, one that is aimed at preserving or maintaining the purchasing power of the dollar. When the American people believe once again in the credibility of the dollar and the credibility of the currency, when you'll see the bond market reopen and long-term markets, you'll recognize, I think, the fact that interest rates can come down as people are willing to hold paper over a longer period of time than they are today. Automobile dealers tell me today that 40 to 50% of the cars that they are selling cannot qualify for loans because people are not willing to hold that paper over a 6 months time
What
frame.
would you expect President Reagan to do about the Federal Reserve Board's
that
policy?
pressure be put on the Fed to change its policy, to stop following a very narrow definition of money around which there seems to be an agreement, as you point out. But as far as I'm concerned and as far as I can tell, it has caused a total breakdown in the believability, if you will, or the credibility, as I put it earlier, in monetary policy. And as I said earlier, and I want to say it once again, the Board of Governors are decent people and they are patriotic, but they really do welcome the higher rates of unemployment and the decline in the use of factories and the utilization of our industrial output as an answer to inflation.
Mr. Rowan?
It isn't, it hasn't been, and it won't be in the future.
Well, Mr. Congressman, let's come right out with it. When you're talking about this kind of a policy, the Fed, what you're talking about is going to some kind of a gold-based money, aren't you?
Well, I basically believe that we ought to have a dollar as good as gold. As far as I'm concerned, however, even the interest rate target that was used by the Fed up until 1979 was a better target than what we've had today. Because if you look at interest rates since 1979, when the Fed shifted from targeting the interest rate of the country to targeting the monetary aggregates, you can see wild fluctuations since 1979. And we've now had 2 recessions, Mr. Rowan, in the 2 years of Mr. Volcker's term as chairman of the Fed. It's unacceptable, I believe, to the American people, and it has to be changed. That's all I'm suggesting.
But you said the Fed is sitting there cheeringly collapse the economy. They really want a recession. They should change the policy. To come back to what Mr. Monroe put to you, what do you want the Fed to do? To abolish its money supply targets, go back to interest rate targets?
That would be better than what we have now.
Well, how
I
could
would
they do
prefer that there be a reconstituted international monetary system so that banks, central banks in the world, could start targeting the value of the money instead of the narrow supply of money. Because every time the Federal Reserve comes up with a narrow definition of money, instruments are created outside of those narrow definitions that ultimately get outside of the purview of the narrow targets of the Fed. And it's not working. It hasn't worked in Britain. And very frankly, it's putting pressure on fiscal policy to go make draconian cuts in the budget and to raise taxes. And I think that would be a big mistake for this economy.
From your point of view, though, is there any way of shifting from what the monetary policy now is without adopting some commodity or gold standard? Isn't that what you basically are advocating?
I'm advocating a price theory instead of a quantity theory. And there are many ways from a utilitarian standpoint that you can get lower interest rates without going back to a full gold standard. But I think eventually most people recognize that wherever a government or a civilization tries to manage paper, as we are doing today with a paper standard, Mr. Rowan, it has not worked and has brought about a collapse of the currency. And we are seeing a vote of no confidence in the monetary policy of this country, as has been happening in Britain. And I think it has to be changed if the Reagan economic recovery program is to work.
Ms. Myers?
Mr. Kemp, on Friday, the Reagan administration reversed years of government policy and restored tax-free status to schools which discriminate against blacks. That, in essence, puts the federal government in the business of subsidizing segregation. Do you agree with that decision?
I have not studied that decision as carefully as I would like to or probably should. As far as I'm concerned, this government ought to guarantee, as far as it is humanly and legally possible, the right of all citizens to those civil and human rights to which you allude in your question. As far as I'm concerned, if it takes tax policy to change or to protect the civil rights of our citizens, it should be used. So I would like to look at that decision from the context of the government's guarantee to people that we would be colorblind, race blind, if you will, with regard to the entrance into schools. As far as I'm concerned, that is a very important part of our government's guarantee to all citizens.
Well, the action raised, I think, the broader question, particularly among civil rights leaders. This administration has favored watering down the Voting Rights Act. They're against affirmative action. They are against school busing. Benjamin Hooks, the head of the NAACP, finally said that this administration is, quote, finally going to have to wear the tag of a racist administration?
I don't accept Mr. Hook's comment about the administration, and I think that's unfair or ad hominem, really. But as far as I'm concerned, the number one issue for civil rights in the 1980s is to make sure that the doors which were opened by the law in the 50s and 60s are not now closed by the economy in the 80s. And as rapidly as the doors were opened to social and economic freedom for blacks and Hispanics and women and others in the 1960s and 70s, it is now the economy which has become the civil rights issue of the 80s, because frankly those doors are being closed more by the economy than by any other consideration.
We have about 2.5 minutes. Mr. Kalb?
Mr. Kemp, what is the unemployment rate in Buffalo now?
Much higher than the national average.
What is it?
Buffalo, I would say it's maybe 12, perhaps higher. There's a great deal of underemployment. New York State as a whole has had underemployment and unemployment for a number of years. And very frankly,
Which
that's
groups
one
of
reason
people
why
are
I'm so strongly resisting the move to raise taxes.
which groups of people are particularly affected?
Teenagers are affected, factory workers in auto and steel, blacks. There's a very serious problem in many of the inner cities of our country, and I think it has
Given
to
what
be
those
addressed.
people are experiencing now, why should they believe what you say about supply-side economics and the wonders?
I think the factory workers in Buffalo and the people of the inner cities of our country, as well as those who are either unemployed or underemployed, recognize that you do not raise taxes in recessions. You do not add continual burdens on the productive sector as an answer to our economic problems. I think also they recognize that there's a very important need in this country to restore honest money so that we can get interest rates down and establish the conditions for the lubrication, if you will, of the private enterprise system. If the private enterprise system, I admit, cannot solve these problems, people turn to government. And one way I think you can hold down government spending, Mr. Kalb, is by removing the need for government spending, by making the private sector grow again. And I think, frankly, that is the number one issue in the 1980s, to reduce the deficit not by raising taxes or draconian budget cuts, but by making this economy grow in such a fashion as we can balance the budget as was balanced under President Kennedy's policies in the early 1960s.
Mr. Kemp, do you think it would be legitimate for Democrats to ask voters in the congressional elections coming up later this year, are you better off than you were 2 years ago?
I absolutely think that not only is it legitimate, I think they will, and they have a right to do it from an intellectual and political standpoint. And Republicans will face the same question as a party that the Democrats faced in the 1980s. I think we're going to have a recovery. I think 1982 will be a much better year than 1981. All I'm suggesting is it will be a much better year for all Americans if we turn our attention towards restoring, once again in this country, honest money, sound currency, and a stable world monetary system.
Thank you, Mr. Kemp, for being with us today on Meet the Press. Meet the Press will return next Sunday to our regular post-football season starting time, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central Time, in other words, half an hour later on most of these stations. I'll be back in a minute with word about next week's guest and a look at letters.